With the election of the new Pope Leo XIV, let's look at the strange history of the conclave in the election of popes, from how the conclave came to be to the man who was Pope 3 times. Today the cardinals are locked in seclusion during a conclave, cut off from the outside world until a new Pope is chosen. But this practice wasn't always part of the process. It began as a desperate measure to break a deadlock. By the 13th century, the lack of clear rules for electing a Pope had become a serious problem, and nowhere was that more obvious than after the death of Pope Clement IV in 1268. The cardinals convened in the town of Viterbo, a papal stronghold north of Rome, and what followed became the longest and most chaotic election of a pope in history. It was a turning point that forced the church to rethink how it chose its leader. 20 cardinals were eligible to vote, and they arrived with all the divisions one might expect from a fractured Christendom. Loyalties were split between those aligned with the French crown and those sympathetic to the Holy Roman Empire. Days turned into weeks, weeks became months, negotiations stalled. By the time a year had passed, the people of Viterbo had grown restless. With no pope and no end in sight, governance at the highest level of the church remained paralysed. In the end, the election at Viterbo would drag on for nearly 3 years, 1,006 days in total. It remains the longest papal election in history. As frustrations mounted, the local citizens took drastic action. In an unprecedented move, they ordered the cardinals locked inside the episcopal palace. They reduced their meals and, according to later chroniclers, even removed part of their roof to expose the cardinals to the elements. The idea was simple: discomfort might achieve what debate could not. These measures seem to have worked. The cardinals finally reached an agreement in 1271, selecting a compromise candidate, Teobaldo Visconti, an archdeacon who was not even a cardinal at the time. By the time an agreement was reached, 3 of the cardinals had passed away. Visconti was away in the Holy Land on crusade when the news of his election reached him. Upon returning, he took the name Gregory X, and he had not forgotten the ordeal that preceded his election. Determined to prevent another such debacle, he introduced a new set of procedures at the Second Council of Leon in 1274. His decree, Ubi Periculum, where there is danger, laid the foundation for the modern conclave. From that point forward, cardinals were to be enclosed, literally locked in during a papal election. They would be denied contact with the outside world, and if no decision was reached within a few days, their food rations would be reduced, eventually to bread, water, and wine. The message was clear: the election of a pope was a sacred duty, not a political game. But some men do not want such a duty, yet find themselves elected as pope, such as Pope Celestine V, whose brief reluctant reign left behind 2 lasting legacies, one of resignation and another marking the end of an era. After the death of Pope Nicholas IV in 1292, the cardinals once again fell into deadlock. A dozen men gathered in the hope of electing a successor, yet nearly 2 years passed without resolution. Factionalism, personal ambition, and political entanglements, especially among French and Roman interests, blocked consensus. The church remained leaderless, and the College of Cardinals, paralysed by indecision, began to draw scorn from the wider Christian world. It was under this pressure that an extraordinary proposal emerged: the election of a holy man from outside the college. Pietro de Morone was an elderly Benedictine hermit who spent most of his life in ascetic solitude, living in the mountains of Abruzzo. He was widely regarded as a man of deep piety and spiritual wisdom, but he was no cardinal. In fact, he never held a senior position in the church. He was in every way an outsider, and yet that was precisely the appeal. Tired of political maneuvering, some cardinals believed that a pure and humble figure might restore moral authority to the papacy. After much discussion, and with encouragement from King Charles of Naples, who saw strategic advantage in the choice, the cardinal sent word to Pietro. At first he resisted. He was in his 80s and had no desire to leave his hermitage, let alone assume the most powerful role in Christendom. But pressure mounted, and in 1294, after weeks of entreaty, he reluctantly accepted and was crowned as Pope Celestine V. From the beginning, his papacy was marked by unease. Celestine, lacking experience, was unable to manage the complex machinery of the Curia. He relied heavily on advisors, some of whom had political motives of their own. He issued a flurry of edicts, some contradictory, and chose to govern from Naples rather than Rome, drawing further criticism. Overwhelmed and isolated, he began to consider the unthinkable: resignation. In December of that same year, after just 5 months on the papal throne, Celestine issued a formal decree declaring that a pope, under certain conditions, could lay down the office voluntarily. Days later, he did so himself. The act was unprecedented, but legally valid. For the first time in church history, a pontiff had resigned not under duress or deposition, but by his own hand. His successor, Boniface VIII, concerned about Celestine becoming a figurehead for opposition, had him placed under guard in a remote fortress. Celestine remained there until his death in 1296, a prisoner in all but name. Revered by some for his humility and criticized by others for his weakness, his brief reign nevertheless established a principle that a pope could abdicate, a right that would not be exercised again until resignation of Benedict XVI in 2013. Celestine's election was also strange in another sense. He was not a cardinal. Of the 266 popes, only 6 were not cardinals. The last non-cardinal elected was Bartolomeo Priagno, Archbishop of Bari in 1378. He was not a member of the College of Cardinals, though he held a prominent administrative position in the papal court. He took the name Urban VI. His election would trigger the Western Schism, a separate crisis in its own right, but it also marked the end of a long tradition. Every pope since Urban VI has been a cardinal prior to election. Today, canon law still technically allows the conclave to choose any baptized male, but in practice, the office is now reserved for cardinals alone. By the late 14th century, the papacy had become not only a spiritual office, but a political prize. The Avignon papacy, a nearly 70-year period in which the seat of the Pope had moved from Rome to the French city of Avignon. Critics accused the papacy of being subservient to the French crown, and among the people of Rome, there was growing resentment that the Bishop of Rome no longer lived in the Eternal City. When Pope Gregory XI returned the papacy to Rome in 1377, it was seen by many as a long overdue correction. But it also set the stage for one of the greatest crises in the history of the Catholic Church. Gregory died in March 1378, barely a year after his return to Rome. With the Curia still adjusting to life back in the city, the College of Cardinals convened to elect his successor. Of the 16 voting cardinals, the majority were French. Outside the conclave walls, the Roman populace was in uproar, demanding that the next pope be Italian. Angry crowds gathered, shouting threats and steering fears of violence. It was under this atmosphere of tension that the cardinals made their decision. They selected Priagno, Archbishop of Bari. Though not a member of the college, he was seen as a compromise candidate, Italian by birth, but not embedded in the factitious Roman factions. He took the name Urban VI. At first, the decision seemed to satisfy both clerical and public concerns. Urban was quickly crowned and the people of Rome rejoiced. But almost immediately, the problems began to surface. Urban's temperament proved volatile. He launched into sharp reforms aimed at curbing the extravagance of the cardinals and the wider bureaucracy. While his zeal may have been well-intentioned, his methods, harsh, inflexible, and openly hostile, alienated many of the very men who just elected him. Within months, a group of cardinals claimed that their original vote had been made under duress from the Roman mob. Declaring the election invalid, they fled the city and convened on their own. In September 1378, they elected a second pope, Cardinal Robert of Geneva, who took the name Clement VII. Europe now had 2 popes, one ruling from Rome and the other from the court in Avignon. The Western Schism had begun. Over the next several decades, the division hardened. Nations and kingdoms took sides. France, Scotland and Castile and others supported the Avignon papacy. England, the Holy Roman Empire, and most of Italy recognized the Pope in Rome. The schism was not merely theological or legal, it was political, geographic, and deeply destabilizing. Each claimant to the papacy appointed his own cardinals, issued his own decrees, and excommunicated the other. The faithful, caught in the middle, were left to wonder who was the true successor of Peter. Efforts to resolve the crises repeatedly failed. In 1409, a council was convened in Pisa and attempted to depose both popes and elect a new one, hoping to unify the church. Instead, the result was an even more tangled mess. Neither of the 2 existing popes recognized the decision, and now there was 3 popes, one in Rome, one in Avignon, and one in Pisa. The schism would drag on, finally ending at the Council of Constance. This time, with the backing of the Holy Roman Emperor and broad consensus, the council succeeded in deposing or accepting the resignation of all 3 rival claimants. In 1417, they elected a new pope, Martin V, who was universally recognized. In the long and complex history of the papacy, few names evoke as much controversy or confusion as Pope Benedict IX. His story defies conventional expectations of the papal office. He was sat on the throne of St. Peter not once, but 3 separate times, and remains the only man in history to have done so. Even more shockingly, during one of his reigns, he sold the papacy, an act that scandalized the Christian world. Benedict was born Theophylactus of Tusculum, a member of one of the most powerful aristocratic families in 11th century Rome. The Tusculani had turned papal politics into a family affair. Several relatives had already occupied the papal throne. Thanks to their influence and bribery, Theophylactus was elected pope in 1032, when he was likely somewhere between 18 and 20. He was shockingly young and woefully unprepared for the office. From the outset, Benedict's papacy was marred by scandal. He was accused of everything from bribery and nepotism to debauchery and violence. Peter Damian, a later reformer and cardinal, referred to him as a demon from hell in the disguise of a priest. The moral failings of the youthful pontiff provoked outrage, not only among the clergy, but also within the Roman populace. He was driven from Rome in 1044 by a popular uprising, and in his absence, a rival candidate, John of Sabina, was elected as Pope Sylvester III. But Benedict had not abdicated. He considered himself to be the true pope and soon returned to Rome, forcing Sylvester out and reclaiming the throne in 1045. This marked his second reign, though its legitimacy is hotly disputed. The strangest twist came shortly thereafter. Benedict, reportedly disillusioned with the demands of papal life and desiring to marry, chose to abdicate. But he did not step down in pious reflection. Instead, he sold the papacy, quite literally, to his godfather, who paid a substantial sum to take over the office. His godfather became Pope Gregory VI, and Benedict formally resigned in May 1045. However, this was not the end of Benedict's involvement. The transaction, a blatant act of simony, the buying and selling of church offices, created a crisis of legitimacy. Although Gregory had noble intentions and hoped to restore order, the scandal tainted his rule. Meanwhile, Sylvester still claimed the papacy, and Benedict himself, unhappy with how events unfolded, returned once more in 1046, seizing control of parts of Rome, but Gregory was still seen as the official pope. This chaotic three-way papal dispute between Sylvester, Benedict, and Gregory prompted the intervention from the Holy Roman Emperor Henry III, who called a Council of Sutri in December 1046. The council opposed both Sylvester and Gregory, the latter stepping down voluntarily, and declared Benedict's claim invalid. Henry then appointed a new pope, Clement II, effectively ending Benedict's claim. But when Clement II died in October 1047, Benedict took back the Lateran Palace in November and reclaimed the papacy, this being his official third reign as pope. But by July 1048, German troops forced him out. Damasus II, a German, was then elected pope and accepted without dispute. If you want to read more about the topics discussed in this video, there are books in the description. And if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. It can really help small channels like mine. See you next time.